Kim Deans. We are very lucky to have Kim here today. Kim has been working in the soils and agricultural area for perhaps 30 years, I think, helping agribusinesses transition to a more sustainable worldview. So I will let Kim introduce herself a little bit more because I'm sure I haven't really done that justice at all. And so, yes, Kim, over to you. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to come and share with you guys for a little while this evening. Yeah, I am based near Inverell in northern inland New South Wales, about an hour and a bit northwest of Armidale, if that helps, on Anawan country. And yeah, I've been in ag for about 30 years. I've been working with soils in our own landscape for about 20 years. We bought a block of land 20 years ago, and it was granite soil that had been mined for tin. I grew up on the heavy black soils west of Inverell, but this was a very different context. Granite soil sluiced for tin, very degraded site. And trying to grow anything here, we had to learn to restore soil health. And that journey's really connected me. Soil's been important to me since I was a child. But, in studying uni, we were talking a little bit about universities before. I studied rural science at the University of New England, which was a very science-based degree back in the day. And I remember taking soil science. We did it most years. Then I took it as an elective. It was a very holistic program, but one of my few electives was soils because I knew it was important. But back in the late 80s, early 90s, there was just like I wasn't getting something and it wasn't really engaging me like I thought it would. And about probably 10 years ago, I discovered why. And it was that whole soil biological realm that I wouldn't say we didn't know about it, but weren't really focusing on soil biology. And it really connected me with what I was looking for that I didn't know. And it's really helped shape our journey with soil health restoration is understanding that biological link. So it really connected the puzzle for me. And I probably started, in our own life, I've been passionate about soil. We've been restoring soils for 20 years. I started working in the private consulting space in about 2018 with Integrity Soils. You might have heard of Nicole Masters through some of the work she's done. She's written a book called For the Love of Soil. And that was great because I started to really work then with landholders who were looking at soil restoration strategies through a lens of not selling inputs, but supporting the people who are making the decisions around landscapes to look at soil health and develop strategies that fit different contexts. So hopefully that gives you a bit of background on me. What else can I tell you? Probably tonight we're going to talk about some topics that I could talk about a day on each. So I've really picked what I think are the keys I want to share with you tonight. I'm sure there'll be questions. You may have more questions than answers after my presentation. That's actually a good thing because, we've really got to start looking at what are we asking and what are we focusing on when we look at soils and landscape restoration. So don't be put off by that. It's really to get curious and start to look at things from a different point of view, I guess. So I might share my screen with you before I forget I haven't and start talking away the slides. So I might just share them. Hopefully you can see my screen. Now, have you got the screen with just the PowerPoint slide on front of you? Or, yeah, cool. You haven't got my notes. I've got two screens and I always get a bit tricky which way they go. So these are the three key points we're going to look at tonight quickly. We're going to have the basics of soil health, some basic ecological processes that have really supported me to understand soil health restoration, and look at that whole interesting topic of how we look at weeds from an ecological point of view, and really start to think about what that offers us, I guess. But the first thing is healthy soils. We'd love to see soils like this, wouldn't we, in the picture with a beautiful crumb structure like that. A healthy soil is so important. There's not much that doesn't come back to healthy soils anywhere, really. But it's that whole ability to hold onto and release and cycle nutrients through the system. It's also such an important part of the water cycle. And they're full of, life. We're discovering I think we don't know much of what we don't know about soil biology. It's a huge unknown, and I think all the time we're learning more and more about it. But 1 teaspoon of healthy soil has billions of microorganisms. It's just amazing, isn't it? Um, this healthy soil, when it's full of life and functioning well in terms of nutrient cycling and water cycling, and has air, it also can protect plants and animals against pests and diseases. It's decomposing, detoxifying, buffering, and helping support our resilience to climate change. But it's also supporting, more and more we're discovering how much the soil microbiome is supporting the things that plants need to be healthy. And a truly healthy plant is actually nourished by soil microbes rather than hydroponically. I think we all sort of started off thinking it was just the nutrients, but it's this complex web of how we get our nutrition. And there's a lot of work being done now that shows that, if a plant is nourished in a healthy soil full of soil biology, the biology are really crucial for getting the plant the nutrients in a form that's healthy for them. And it's also, obviously growing nutrient dense plants, and having nutrient dense plants means we have healthy animals, healthy people, a healthy everything, really. So that's what it's all about. It is about resilience and addressing, carbon sequestration and climate change. But it's linked back to everything. Like, when we get rainfall events and climatic events, the health of our soil is the major buffer. I was at a conference a couple of years ago on soils, and they were talking about the floods in Lismore. And one of the people there had research from Southern Cross Uni, had done some research on the sediment load in that flood. And out of the 14 meters of water that went through Lismore, they reckon 2 meters was sediment. So you can see how much, like, if that soil had been able to absorb water, it was pretty extreme. So of course it's challenging, but the more we can keep soil in place, we lessen the impact of these really extreme climatic events. And we also become a more drought resilient, fire resilient, etc. So it's got so many roles, hasn't it? One of the things I'm pretty passionate about is taking a really holistic view of soil health. And as I said, that soil biological piece was like the missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle for me when I came across it. And I'm constantly learning. I will never call myself an expert because there's so much to learn. And you just constantly, if you're curious and out observing and looking at soils and getting exposed to different contexts, you constantly learn a lot about this topic. But, if we look at it in a holistic fashion, soil organic matter is the key to all of this. It's a part of that mineral health of the soil, where we can look at mineral health through a soil test, looking at the minerals and their availability to plants, etc. And we've often focused there, like a lot of our focus on soils has been there, and it's definitely part of this puzzle. But when we focus on just that and take our eye off the physical health, sometimes what we're doing can have consequences that go unnoticed, unintended consequences. So, in agriculture, we've been throwing a lot of inputs on, and a lot of tillage and a lot of herbicides. And if we just rely on a soil test to tell us what fertilizers to put on, we miss the fact that our soil structure is declining, the soil organic matter is declining, that we end up with soil that won't absorb water because it's compacted and it's dead and lifeless. And the physical soil health, like monitoring soil compaction, structure, those kinds of things, water infiltration, is really an important aspect of soil health. And they all go together. They're also then the biological health. They all, like, I can't look at one without the other, because the biology are what create the physical health of the soil. They are they produce the glues that give the soil its soil structure. They also help cycle minerals. And sometimes mycorrhizal fungi can go out into the soil and get nutrients, extending the plant root system greatly. They have such an important role, don't they, in helping all of this work together. But sometimes it's hard to change the physical and biological health without the minerals as well. So, different strategies fit different contexts. If you've got very heavy clay soils, they're huge in terms of cation exchange capacity. And in my experiences and the context I've worked in, they take a bit longer to shift. The granite soil I'm on is very light soil, and they tend to respond a bit quicker, but then they don't have that store of clay to hold water either. So they have other limitations. But I know those really heavy clays can take a bit of TLC to get back into life, you know, because they are such big soils. But once they do start kicking, they've got, you know, a lot of minerals in the bank account for the biology to start to access and bring make available to the plants. So, but organic matter is the bridge. It connects all of these three components. And this is a slide that really sums it up. You'll probably gather by the end of this, I'm pretty passionate about soil organic matter, basically because it is the life force of the soil. It is that source of energy for soil microbes. It also keeps the soil temperature even. You know, when I'm monitoring soil health in the field with clients, we do like sort of monitoring based programs. And when there's a soil really low in organic matter, the soil temperature shifts with the daytime temperature through the day. But in a soil that's got a good level of organic matter, that soil temperature is much more stable, which is obviously a much better home for the microbes that we want to encourage to help restore our soil health and keep everything functioning. So it's really important on that angle, but it's also a source of cation exchange capacity. It influences our mineralization. It can be broken down and cycled through a system that's living and functioning to help that mineral cycle, and through those decomposition processes as well. But there's also that physical structure, and it's part of the physical structure of your soil as well. It's got so many properties. The most important thing for me about soil organic matter, though, is 1% soil carbon, which is what makes up soil organic matter, can store 144,000 litres of water per hectare. So that's a pretty big incentive to look at that level. And, you know, it's a no-brainer that if we can improve our soil organic matter and our soil carbon, we are going to improve the water cycle and the water holding capacity of these landscapes. That then helps to just promote everything, doesn't it? You know, our microbes need water, they need air, they need food, and all of these things go together to create that. So that's really the key, I think. This is a diagram out of one of my books on my shelf. I've just forgotten the name of it. It's about soil biology. And in a healthy soil, we would like to see these components. Like we'd like to see a 5% organic matter. We'd like to see 25% air. We'd like to see 25% of that being water and 45% of that being mineral. But after a lot of use and abuse in agriculture, we often lose that air and water component and organic matter component and have very compact soils. When we start to think about soil health, we've really got to think about air first, because if we want life to be able to create the system that's going to restore that soil organic matter and everything else, we need the microbes to be able to breathe. You know, they're not going to survive very long without air. We also need the water. So if you think about a life support system for your soil, it's really important that we remember that we've got to find ways to get good soil structure back so that we have air and water to support the life in our soil. So Christine Jones, you've probably heard of her. She's pretty famous in Australian soil circles. If you haven't, definitely check out her website. I think it's called Amazing Carbon. And she's been doing soils research for many years. Also started out at UNE as I did, but we sort of didn't cross paths there at all. But her work has been a huge source of inspiration to me and so many others in this space, that she has done a lot of research and has found that while it's really hard to go back to pre-colonialisation in Australia, there's an estimation that we've probably lost between 50 and 80% of that organic carbon in our soils, which is quite huge, isn't it? And that has a huge impact on the environment. You know, look at the dust storms, flooding rains, dirty rivers, all the things. That soil carbon was the glue holding those ecosystems together. And it really does give us that landscape function, water quality, productivity, and everything else that goes along with it. But yeah, and that water holding capacity of soil organic matter is just huge. And it's something that I think beats any other incentive around carbon, is to restore our water back to health. As far as the soil goes, it's also that, as I said, that reservoir of plant available nutrients and the structure in which all of those little microbes that we're just starting to learn more about make their home. I reckon Graham Sate's got some research that he's quoted where 4% organic matter is necessary before we really have a healthy microbial workforce. And if that organic matter is less than 1.7%, we've got a pretty dead soil. And unfortunately, in agricultural soils, particularly those that have had a lot of intensive cropping or broadacre cropping, it's very common up in this area to see those cropping soils that are less than 1% organic matter now. Grazing country can be much better than that, and grasslands, but it varies across the board. So it's just interesting to think that, you know, that's often our biggest challenge, is to start changing the cycle that is happening in terms of organic matter. In the carbon cycle, like, I'm only going to touch on this, but one of the things that's been most helpful for me to understand is how we restore soil carbon. And we have to have photosynthesizing plants to restore soil carbon. There's no other way to do it. There's 2 decomposition processes in the soil, carbon cycles in the soil that contribute to soil carbon. One is the decomposition process, which is this little, let's see if I can see my cursor, this one on where the residues of those plants get broken down into soil carbon. Then there's also what we're discovering is called the liquid carbon pathway, which is, again, was sort of first clarified by Christine Jones's work in My Knowledge, where she sort of realized these plants are also through photosynthesis, capturing sunlight, converting sunlight and carbon dioxide into sugars that they feed down through the root system, which they actually are feeding to the microbes in the soil. And in this process, you know, they have a beneficial relationship between the microbes and the plants that supports this carbon exudation and carbon fixation in the soil. One of her papers explains that the liquid carbon pathway, where the photosynthesizing plant is feeding sugars down into the soil through the root system, is almost 6 times more efficient at getting soil carbon levels re-established than the decomposition pathway. Because I guess with decomposition, so we lose a lot of that to oxidation. It's on the soil surface, where the liquid carbon pathway is more efficient. So it really highlights, when you start to think about that, how important having healthy growing photosynthesizing plants are to restore ecosystems. You know, there's one of the quotes I do love was out of a book on soil health, and it was, if you have bare ground, your soil is starving. You know, you've got nothing to feed the soil food web that creates all of these processes and supports them all to happen. So that's you know, pretty much the carbon cycle, as simple as I can make it. But if we think of that in terms of the ecosystem processes, those really key core issues that we're looking at when we're restoring an ecosystem, these are sort of inspired by holistic management, but the community dynamics is the one I'm going to talk about tonight, plant successional dynamics in ecosystems. But we also need to just remember that these ecological processes are also the water cycle, the mineral cycle, as we've talked about, and energy flow, which is where our whole planet runs on sunlight and our ecosystems run on sunlight. So it's our ability to capture solar energy and flow that through green photosynthesizing plants and keep that energy flowing through the landscape. So it starts as photosynthesis, it then feeds the soil, but it's going through everything from there, isn't it? The plants are capturing it, and almost like the conduit from between the sun and the life on the planet. So they are all important, but today we're just going to talk about community dynamics, because in terms of soil health, it might give you it's given me some really aha moments when I look at landscapes and soils and weeds. So I think we'll just focus on that one. And when I talk about community dynamics, it's plant succession. This is a great image. There's a few different ones like this that you can see in different resources on different websites, but this one's from Elaine Ingham from the Soil Food Web. And it's describing that process of soil formation, where in nature, this process is going on all of the time. This is how nature works. Like, soil starts off as rocks, and over time, lichens and mosses can colonize those rock faces and start to break down rocks into soils. This can take hundreds of years, if not longer, depending on the context, the climate, everything else. Nature has a much longer time frame than we do, doesn't it? You know, that the minute we leave land alone and undisturbed, it's constantly working to take that land back to a climax community. And like I said, it could be hundreds of years later that it gets there, but that's the direction nature's trying to go. everything we've done in agriculture has sent this system backwards. So if we've cleared a forest to plough paddocks for crops or pastures, we've moved this successional process back. We've gone back to often we want to grow grasses and perennials, but then often when we're restoring an ecosystem, all it wants to grow are these weedy annual plants, if we're lucky. Sometimes I've actually seen soils, you may have too, that are just lichen. They're back to basically soil formation. So when you see soil with lichen and moss, it's successionally, it's right back here in the soil formation process. I hope that makes sense. Just to think about nature's process, the way it's developing and working is always going towards more complexity, but it's doing it gradually. Different plants will come in and move through an ecosystem over time, but in our lifetime, sometimes it can seem like it's taking too long to shift without a bit of intervention, I guess. The other part of this is also the soil biological processes that accompany this plant successional dynamic. So this is, I find, really, really interesting. Just as those grasslands and our ecosystems are evolving towards more complexity, as the soil follows suit, it becomes more fungal. So when we're in those early stage rock face, very low successional stages of soil formation, we mostly have bacteria in the microbial community. And as over time, there's a lot of more microbes than just bacteria and fungi, but they're the base of the soil food web. So when, we want a grassland to thrive, it needs bacteria and fungi in a fairly balanced ratio. And a forest likes a really fungal soil. It still has bacteria in it, but it has a lot more fungi. And, trees have those beautifully established communication networks with mycorrhizal fungi and, all of those types of things. So if you're looking to establish grasslands and nurture grasslands, but all you've got growing are weeds, it's suggesting to me that the plant successional process is somewhere back here. And we want it to be here, but these plants are doing a job, and probably in their own time will eventually get to here. What can we do to nurture it along is the question. And similarly, when we want to grow trees, we often plant those trees in a very degraded system. And I've had an aha moment around this myself. Realizing that we'd been trying to get all these trees to grow in a bacterial grassland, and wondering why some of them were dying, some of them took a lot of TLC, the odd one would thrive. And once we realized that we need to support the soil to be more fungal and create the system that's more friendly to trees, we've had a lot more success in our tree planting programs, using wood chips to build the soil, using, inoculating the soil biology with leaf litter from under similar trees. Also, when we're planting trees, to introduce some of the biology into that. But also in grasslands, if we think about restoring grasslands, we're starting to think about how can we support this system to move towards a more fungal state that's going to support more perennial species rather than the weedy annuals. And so I hope that gives you a bit of food for thought on what's going on underneath the ground. There's so much more to this topic, but it's really just to give you the basics of this to go away and think about and learn more about as well. And down in Victoria, you have a wealth of information on soil biology in Dr. Mary Cole, who runs the AgPath laboratories and does a lot of soil biological testing. So you can access some lab tests out of Melbourne that look at soil microbes and soil microbiology and learn more about where soils are at in terms of the balance that's happening. But you think about weeds, like this leads me into that topic of weeds that I said I'd talk about. I'm going to bring all this together at the end. There's a lot in these topics. And think about how we react to weeds in our landscapes. I'm sure you're familiar with the approach. We're trained to kill, aren't we? It's just become... I grew up on a farm. I've killed many weeds myself as an adult in various different roles and contexts. And I haven't ever had much luck eliminating these plants. There's been a lot of work and a lot of time, energy, and money spent on them. But if you think about it, it's been ingrained in us. And I will also mention, like with weeds, there are sometimes legislation requirements around legal reasons to control plants, etc. So I'm, not disregarding any of that in this topic, but just to think about, is killing always going to work? But, I think herbicides particularly have become the weapon of choice. They're so easy and convenient, and there's a whole generation of farmers now who've never known farming without herbicides. So it's just what you do. So it's very much part of the landscape. And I'm not saying it's not a tool in the toolbox, but I think we need to think about how well it's working for us, and start to think about weeds in the landscape. If you think about weeds, we're often trained that there'll be a threat. We've got to detect and surveillance on the weeds. There's a real language of fear around it, and it's ingrained in all of us, I think, who've had that history. Even the names of herbicides are given some pretty funny names like Terminator or Hammer or things like that, all about killing things in that landscape. But if we think about how well is this actually working for us, how are we going with this? And I've actually been down a rabbit hole on herbicides recently, looking at options and different options for a project I'm working on. And what else can we do? And we're not saying we're not going to ever use a herbicide, but what are our options to do things differently? Because when we think about how well it's working for us, there's often a lot of unintended consequences. I was pretty flabbergasted to read recently in the latest ABARE survey that weeds and pests are costing Australian farmers over $5 billion a year. 82% of that cost is herbicides. So it's pretty huge, isn't it? And that's $5 billion that's going out of our local communities and our Australian economy to support the chemical companies. And not saying that we don't sometimes use these chemicals, but that's an awful lot. And along with that, we've got growing herbicide resistance issues as well. So, that's becoming an issue for a lot of people to address. I think along with that, like there's times and places for all these tools in our toolbox, but I think we've often had this preconceived notion that herbicides target weeds and they're not going to impact anything else. But they're actually coming out with more and more scientific studies on how many non-target organisms are being impacted by herbicides. Honeybees, pollinators, earthworms, birds are all impacted by herbicide use. I was only looking out the window of my office the other day watching some rosellas eating dandelion flowers. And, if I'd sprayed those, that wouldn't have been good, So there's also all these food sources in our environment that other animals in the food chain are using. There's also a lot more studies coming through that show herbicides decrease soil health. And it's basically because we're stopping that carbon cycling dynamic, especially when we use herbicides and leave everything dead. I know in grasslands that's often not the case. It's more kind of spot spraying, but it's also, whenever we use a herbicide, it's also impacting soil biology. Glyphosate's often the most commonly used herbicide, and it's actually been shown to harm soil microbes as well as the human gut microbes. So, when we kill those weeds, we're also harming those soil microbes that support our whole system. So there are things we can do when we use herbicides to buffer them and reduce the harm to the ecosystem and use less and do better with it. But it is, something we just need to be mindful of when we do use that tool. How can we minimize the harm? How can we use it efficiently? Do as least harm as possible to non-target organisms, and what can we do that helps that pesticide break down in the environment? There's a few tools you can use, like buffering with carbon sources and things like that, to help support the breakdown of those products. But I think the biggest unintended consequence of these tools is that we've actually created this really linear thinking process, that we see a weed and we act like the weed is a sign of a herbicide deficiency. And we're not reading the weed and what it's telling us about the ecosystem, and it's actually telling us an awful lot. So, it's about trying to break that habitual form and say, well, what's the weed telling us and how can we manage it in a different way to get a different outcome? And that's what I find really fascinating, the more I learn about this, and the more I learn, the more questions I have, but it's constantly evolving, this space, and more people are starting to share their observations and different techniques around managing weeds, not just killing them, but how do we work with them? And part of that is also considering, when I share some of these ideas on weeds, if you want to go deep on this, I did a webinar last week with ACT NRM on weeds as indicators, and there is a recording available for that where I go into this one topic in a much deeper way. So I can send the link through if you want to watch it. But just remember, this is information only. I can't give you advice on what to do in your context. There's no one size fits all answer. And we all have to take responsibility for our own weed decisions. There's always, like I said before, legal requirements around specific plants in specific areas that we also need to be mindful of. And all of these approaches, when we start to take a more ecological approach, actually take time. There's no quick fix in this. So, just think this is you to contemplate and consider how the principles apply in your context. But if you think about those weedy plants, the plants we call weeds, and the role they have in the ecosystem, they do a few important jobs. And you saw where they sat in that plant successional process. They come in early in the stages, and they do that because they can cycle minerals. They can break up soil compaction. A lot of weedy plants have a beautiful taproot and are great at breaking up compacted soils. They create ground cover. Like, nature doesn't like bare soil. It's always going to put something in there, isn't it? They'll also improve soils because they're often, I know that there's many weeds once you start to look at them, and I'll encourage you to dig them up and look at their root system and learn about these plants, start to look at the soil beneath those weedier plants and see how that compares to some of the other areas. It's often better. A lot of these weedy plants have medicinal values if you go back in time. They're nutritious when we look at grazing systems. Some of them have so much crude protein. They're great feed sources if people have animals grazing in a system. But like I said, also there's those ecosystem services, pollination, habitat. They're providing habitat for the soil microbes below the ground, as well as other organisms above the ground, and feeding all of the insects and the birds and the animals that we rely on. But there's 6 main reasons weeds grow that Nicole Masters sums up beautifully in her book, that I often draw on this as a really good place to start. Those weedy plants are growing because they're either coming in to cover the soil. They don't want to have bare soil. Nature's going to put something there. They're coming in because soil organic matter is low, and they can deal with that, and they can grow in those conditions. They're pretty tough and they're pretty adaptable, and they'll grow where all the things we want to grow won't. So, they can manage those situations, particularly compaction. If there's a mineral imbalance, there's different types of weeds that love to grow where there's high nitrates or high potassium, or if there's low phosphorus, they can come in and support the system to return to balance, and work in that way. There's also, like we saw in that plant successional diagram, they can come in because there's a microbial imbalance, like the bacterial fungi ratios are encouraging and sending the signal for those plants to germinate. And some of them come in as what Nicole calls a safety valve for toxins. But the one plant that comes to my mind in that respect is milk thistle, or what we all call these plants different things, but what I call milk thistle up here often comes up in areas that have been herbicided, and it comes in to soak up the toxins in the environment. And milk thistle is also, in human herbal medicine, a liver cleanser to help get rid of toxins. So it's amazing how the parallel sometimes between the role in the environment and the role it had in traditional herbal medicine are often the same. Really interesting when you start to learn about these plants. But that's a pretty big overview of some of the reasons the weeds could be coming up. And it's always, one plant could have a few different reasons in a different context. So it's to understand them and then kind of go, well, what's this plant telling me in this place? What's it showing me? I love this quote by Professor Stuart Hill, and it's, if you kill the plant and its associated role in that ecosystem, you now have to do what that plant was doing. So if that plant came in to fulfill a role in the ecosystem and we don't want it there, what can we do to support that ecosystem so that plant doesn't need to grow? Because if we don't support that role, it's just going to keep coming back. And I'll show you a few photos in a few slides' time on grasslands where we left things alone to move through the successional process, and they did their job and they went. So, because they were able to fulfill that role, make room for the next sequence of plants to come into the environment. There are a few alternative ways to manage weeds, but we often look at nicer ways to kill them as a first step. I think we've all done that. Well, if I don't use a herbicide, is there a nicer way I can kill it? Sometimes you can find some softer options, but ultimately, I think the best alternative is to find a few different ways to approach a plant, not just one tool in the toolbox. And a lot of the research I've been down the rabbit hole of lately reading, when we look at farming systems where they've reduced or eliminated herbicides, they've actually used more than one tool, taken that really integrated approach to the system. So that's also interesting. Another part of the research I've done recently was one farmer in the United States talking about his observations that when two soil health principles were being deviated, like he wasn't adhering to two or more of the soil health principles, which are, keeping the soil covered, minimum disturbance, keeping living roots in the soil, etc., he would end up with weeds. But while he was adhering to his soil health principles, he had less of a problem. I thought that was a really interesting observation, but that's an observational one. There's also science coming through, studying different systems around weed management to really saying across the board in a few different contexts, using more than one tool and taking a real strategic approach to understanding the plant, why it's there, and approaching it from a few different angles is often the best way to do it if you want to change the system, I guess. But it is all linked to soil health, I think. And some of those tools that people are using in grazing systems, it's really grazing management. And you guys are in grasslands that may not be grazed. So that makes it really tricky. There might be wildlife grazing those systems, but that can be really hard to shift a system without being able to use some of the tools in the toolbox. So I guess it's just where you sit and you watch the plant successional process in your landscape, and maybe think about looking at what are our pioneering plants? What are the indicators our system's going backwards or forwards? What are the perennial species we'd like to see back here? What does this system need to sustain them? Because often it's just not quite ready for them again. But some of the other tools that, people are using is, like I said, buffering herbicides with fulvic acid, which is a carbon source that can help those chemicals break down. Is not always compatible, and I'm not a chemical user, so I always tell people to jar test if they're going to use a carbon source with a herbicide to make sure they're not blocking up things when they go spraying. But it can be a really good way to reduce the rate and encourage the breakdown of those chemicals. It's feeding biology, helping move things through. And other times, depending on the weed that it is, just to think about, what does this weed need from us? Sometimes we can take Brix measurements to measure the health of the, how much sugar and how much photosynthesis is happening in the weed versus the grass. What's our system favoring? And as those weeds start to lose their hold, they'll start to be not as healthy in the system. They'll start to become stunted, or they'll gradually move out. And so there's a lot of tools in our toolbox of soil health that we can use to do that. There's some people more in the biodynamic circles. That top diagram is more making a weed tea, where some farmers have composted up the weed itself in water and then applied that on weedy areas. And some of them have reported, the results are variable, but some people have seen quite good responses to composting up a weed as a weed tea and applying that to an area. It almost helps that plant do its job and move on. Other times it's slashing them before they set seed, so the weed's still actually able to function, but not set more seed and add to the problem. So there's a range of different tools that can come through there. So many. And in grasslands, grazing is often a tool. It might not be in every context, but the grazing management aspect is huge with weeds. If those animals aren't managed in a way to sustain the desirable species, they can eat those really palatable, high-performing grasses down to nothing. And the plants, so we end up like that 90% use slide, where this poor plant's been chewed down because it's the best in the paddock. and it gets such a hammering. It takes so much more time to recover from that grazing event. Its root system shrinks. It's not photosynthesizing at all because all the leaves are gone. It's really struggling. And when animals are grazing indiscriminately, they can take out the best species of grass, and all the ones they don't want to eat get a head start. They're left alone to kind of be selected by default. And grazing management's a huge tool for restoring grasslands where it's appropriate in context. It really has been our journey. It's been grazing management, and it's been extraordinary what we've seen happen. In grasslands, because this was a grassland that's been grazed by cattle up on the high country near Gyra, up near where I live. And we were there in 2019 in the thick of record-breaking drought. And this particular paddock had a lot of fleabane. I'm not sure how familiar you guys are with fleabane, but it's not much fun at times, and a lot of people live in fear of it. I'm pretty confident in grasslands it will move on, and I've seen it happen at our place and at this place and others. It's harder in cultivation country, but in a grassland environment, this plant came in, that soil was really high in potassium, and it's known to be a potassium accumulator. It's also got a beautiful deep taproot. It came in that year, and the client was a bit concerned about this particular paddock, because it was wall-to-wall fleabane. And they're worried that there's, I think, 100,000 seeds per plant. They were worried they were going to have a huge problem. So what we did, we took some photos. We also took some records and did a little monitoring technique I call a step point, where we were actually able to walk out 100 steps in the paddock, noting whether we stepped on the tip of our boot was on fleabane or grass. We ended up putting down, I can't remember exactly the percentage of fleabane. I think it was about 20%. It looked a lot worse than that, was fleabane, and the rest was grass. But we did that so that if the next year it came back, we would see if it was getting worse or getting better, because our psychology around these weeds could mean whatever we saw was worse, even if we didn't. Our emotions can mess us up if we don't put numbers around it and if we don't take photos. So photos are a great tool. Monitoring is a great tool if you've got a weedy plant you're worrying about, because then you're taking the emotion out of the issue next year. But next year went back, none of it was left. It was all gone. And it was, it had come in, done its job, moved on. It also needs light to germinate. So once the grass is grown, that weed's done its job. It's not going to be a problem again until there's bare ground or a major disturbance event. We, here at our place, this is some photos we took. We were burnt out in 2019 by fire. And once it did rain, it took a year for us to really get rain after that fire. It was not much fun. But by the time it rained, things started to grow again. We were wall-to-wall fleabane. It came in to soak up the potassium, cycle it through the system, restore the soils. So I was pretty confident after seeing in a few places this weed coming and going in grasslands, took a photo of the same place the following year, all gone through, done its job, so it's going to come in and move on. But having said that, that plant seems to come in for a season at a time and then come back when it's needed. There are other plants that take a bit more to move, but I think if we can support the system to come back to health and help it move in the more favorable direction, we're gradually going to do those weeds out of a job. And if you can find any area at all to let it just grow and do its thing, you will learn about plant succession, because you'll be able to observe it. If we don't allow some things to grow, we don't ever get to see what nature's trying to do. We keep setting the system back, unintentionally trying to help it along. So I want to leave you, if you've got plants that you're really struggling with in your journey, this is a bit of a process for listening to them that I share a bit more in depth in the weeds webinar, but just observe that plant in the field. What is it doing? Dig it up, have a look at its root system. How's the root system structured? Have a look at the soil underneath it and smell the soil underneath those plants if there's no chemicals being used, because often it'll have a beautiful earthy, rich smell. The soil's often, they're there trying to restore our soil for us, but we've just missed their attributes a lot of the time. observe and monitor soil health in the field. Start to look at your soil in a whole different way. Look, dig up the soil, look at the soil structure, look at plant rooting depth, start to look for compaction, start to look at water infiltration and a few things like that to start to get a sense of where your soil health is at physically. Consider what's happened in the past, in the grasslands you're working on, what's been that history. And if there've been areas that have been intensively cropped, they do take time to recover. They've had a pretty hard time of it. Also, overgrazing is just as hard at times, if we've had that going on to recover from. But I like to research the particular plant, like really get an understanding. If you look online, there's some really great resources on weeds, and they'll tell you this is a plant that grows in disturbed areas, or this is a plant that likes these conditions. Once you start to see the trend of what it likes, you can go, okay, is that what I'm seeing in my context? What's it coming through here to do? What's the job it's doing? What's the niche in the ecosystem it's filling? That can help a lot. And consider those 6 reasons weeds grow as one of those or more of those part of the issue. What are the ecological processes doing? Is that plant, like some of these plants are coming in trying to cycle minerals for us, nitrate accumulating weeds, for example. Some of them, are trying to break up compaction, but they're all there trying to support life. They're here to do a job. In nature never has anything that doesn't have a role and a relationship niche to fill in the system, but it's just us trying to figure it out. And I think monitoring those sites over time, if you've got challenges happening in the grasslands, establish photo points and establish monitoring sites and start to learn from what's going on and start to see, because I think it's really valuable to have photos along. You saw my photo, how I took it lined up. Really, I've gotten very good at taking photos lined up along the same transect all the time, because you can really see clearly it's exactly the same place. It's exactly the same tree, exactly the same view. It really helps you to see the change in your landscape over time, because we do forget. One of my biggest regrets is that 20 years ago when we came here, I didn't do that and take more photos. So I tell everyone to make sure you take them from the beginning. But also sometimes if you want to dig a bit deeper on a plant, you can take a leaf test and see if that plant's accumulating minerals. It really, I have had clients do that on the odd occasion, and it has often helped us to kind of go, oh yeah, of course, that's what it's doing here. Some of them we kind of know through other people's research, but that's one option. If the soil's high in nitrates or sodium, that's not going to help you with those minerals, because that will be impacted. But other minerals, definitely those plants can show you that they're accumulating different issues. And remember, like I said, we're taking a whole systems view here. We're connecting the dots between what's happening in the soil and those plants, but also that's also connecting to the whole ecosystem around us. And when we do that, I just wanted to leave you with a few things that are probably coming up for me in this whole journey of restoring landscapes. Is think about that whole journey as being a journey. Like there's many paths we can take to on this, to get to the outcome. There's not one right way. I think we also go through a bit of a rite of passage when we start to get passionate about restoring soils and ecosystems. We try all this stuff with the best of intentions, and things don't always go to plan. And that can be frustrating and all the rest of it, but it's actually feedback. It's not failure. So start to see the feedback. If something's not working, there's something that we're missing or something for us to learn. It's a learning opportunity for us. And if something's not working, don't keep doing it. Look for other alternatives or start to question into, because part of what drives me is finding the opportunities and these challenges to learn and grow and do things differently. The outcomes we're looking for also don't happen in isolation from specific things we do. It's really really about a long-term process, I guess. Like there was a study I read about, some research done in 2021, where they looked at complexity and ecosystem approaches and simplifying things down just to linear approaches. They found might have a short-term solution, but long-term, those unintended consequences often come up. And we often unintentionally decline our resilience and adaptability if we just go for quick fixes. So it challenges us to look long term and build in the relationships, but it's all about relationships. It's all about those relationships in the system and how we connect with that, I guess. How do we, when we think about this, it's how do we harness the photosynthesis that drives all the relationships within that system, and then restores everything from there. So 3 of the key concepts that I find help me is to remember we're collaborating with nature. I used to say that, we grow soil. Now I don't. The soil knows how to grow. The grasses know how to grow. Nature knows how to grow. For us, I think it's really all we can do is help steward the conditions for life, not get too fixated on one outcome, but when we start to steward life, we get amazed with the other outcomes that can come through. It's all about collaborating, isn't it? Life begets life. So, instead of just looking at a problem, look at the way we can bring life into the system. There was a beautiful article, and I can share it with you later if you like. It was by Dee Perhouse, who does a lot of work on soil health and watersheds in the United States. And this, she says, is humans cannot rebuild the soil sponge. Only other species can do that. What humans can do is respect the work of other species, create the conditions in which other species can do their work, collaborate with other species in managing landscapes, and stop interfering with their work. We can allow conditions that maximize the capture of solar energy and carbon dioxide through photosynthesis, and then step back and allow the plant, fungal, bacterial, insect, and animal communities to turn that carbon into healthy living systems that cycle the water, the carbon, the methane, and naturally correct climate extremes. So it was a beautiful article just reminding us as humans that we're part of all this and we can work with it, but we sometimes, in our efforts to really try to fix it, we can try and do things where we're not patient. So, patience is a key in any restoration and any ecological.
So you're just frozen there for a moment, Kim. No good. Don't. Well, we'll just see if Kim comes back. Perhaps has Kim frozen for everyone else too, or it's not just me, is it? Right. Well, I think we've had a malfunction. Is everyone else still with us? If you are, can you turn on your microphone and say you're here?
Yeah, Alan Ford here.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Alan. Good. Glad to know there's life out there. It's
Yeah.
Still here. Yep.
yeah. Great. Okay. Thanks, everyone. That's good. So yeah,
Back again.
Kim froze, and now she's not with us. So we'll hopefully she'll drop back in a second. I think she was getting to the end of her talk, so we can throw some questions with it at her. It's good. It's in the meantime, that's what you.
Okay.
All right. Where am I? Let me just send her a text.
I'm back.
Oh, you're back. Excellent. Very good. Hi, Kim. Don't know quite what happened there, but it was the universe conspired. It's
That window, and I went, oh, I think I've just fallen out.
yes. But I expect without, you must have been almost at your last slide, I suspect.
Yeah, I was.
yeah.
I was.
It was
But
very good.
basically, that whole thing about patience, yeah, and it's hard, isn't it? Like, we want to make such a difference to what we're doing. I think I was just going to mention in closing that whole piece about there was a beautiful podcast I listened to with Nora Bateson, who's a really interesting whole systems thinker. I can send the link to some of these if people are curious. But
Yeah,
she was
please.
talking about in the UK, there's a whole movement about wilding and getting things back to nature. But I think they're heavily subsidized in that realm over there too. So it's a very different context. But she had said, you know, in one of the cases they were talking about, where they were looking like the species that they were coming back, they hadn't seen in many years. They thought they were extinct. But if they were managing just to bring that species back, it probably wouldn't have worked. But because they were managing for the whole of life and the whole of the ecosystem, they got amazed at what did come back. So it was shifting that focus more from that tunnel vision to like just trying to bring life back in. And I think that's, you know, when we do that, we do get amazed at what comes in. We're not so singularly focused on the one problem, but more what's possible. Yeah. So that was all I had to say.
Well, brilliant. Thank you very, very much. That was, yeah, a lovely and very interesting presentation. It's great to be reminded about the complexity of everything there and the need for patience and the importance of looking for alternative approaches to these very complex problems and so on. It's the I wonder sometimes, like so many of these are exotic species. That I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? And so the British are really lucky when they leave their ecosystems alone. Threatened species come back. When we leave our systems alone, it seems like we just we get a lot of weeds taking over. And
yeah, and I think ecosystems are always shifting, aren't they? And we want them to stay how we want them. And I learned that after the fire here. We lost all our gardens, the whole everything. We were lucky our house was still here. So I was grieving the garden a lot, and because we're mad keen gardeners as well. And I was sitting out there looking at the garden and realizing, oh my gosh, I wanted it to stay the same, but nature's got this whole other process that happens where nothing stays the same. It's always moving towards more complexity. And we sort of get this view of a landscape. We want it to look this way and stay it. But it's, and then you get people bringing in all these other plants and all these other things. And it's constantly shifting, isn't it?
it is indeed. And I think that's one of the things we have to, we will have to learn here in Australia with our grasslands is that where there are going to be things like Chilean needlegrass or serrated tussock that are like have defied everyone's attempts to get rid of them, regardless of apart from like turning grassland into trees, perhaps, which is probably a process you could do. But basically, they will naturalize and so on. So we have to learn to appreciate these complex, the new nature, as it were.
The farmers I've seen who've had the best luck with some of those types of grasses have used grazing management as their tool over time. It's not a quick fix, but over time, one lady in particular I know who's an amazing pasture ecologist bought a block of coolertie grass, which is very similar in nature to Chilean needle. And over time,
what sort of grass, Kim?
It's called coolertie grass. It's a very similar type of niche that feels to Chilean needle grass. It's very similar.
Right.
And her grazing management has meant, and monitoring, she's seeing all these diversity of grasses coming back in. It's still there, but it's lost its hold. And so, yeah, it's just trying to figure out what and commit to that course of action over time. Yeah.
Yes, it's that commitment over time is a very difficult one, especially often, isn't it, with government agencies that have targets to meet or whatever. The short-term fix is often seen as the solution when it's might actually be creating more problems down the line. So, and there are a couple of questions in the chat. Andrew Arnold asks if you have come across the Henry Doubleday Research Association and the Soil Association, their publications from the UK.
No, they sound really interesting. Yeah.
Yes, they're very much targeted. You mentioned gardening. Well, they're basically written for gardeners, and they adopt very much the sort of approach you've been talking about, some of their publications, yes. Being concerned about really cultivating soil organisms for the benefit of their gardens, etc.
Yeah.
So you may, I think they're still in operation. My publications are fairly old ones.
Some of
but,
the old stuff's the best though, isn't it, Andrew?
Well, they are, yes. And interestingly, I mentioned Professor Leaper, and my one reservation about Professor Leaper was that he was all about chemistry and not about biology.
Yeah.
That was his shortcoming, but that was the way soil scientists operated back 50 years ago.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I'm just going to put the link.
All
to
these plants are contributing to.
Oops, here it is. Sorry about that. I was just going to get the link to that webinar for you on weeds.
Okay, sorry, who was just speaking then?
That was my computer.
Oh. Okay.
It's all good.
Fantastic.
Keeping it real here with the
Great.
tech. So I've just put the link in
Kim.
answer to that question about the weeds webinar.
Yeah, great. I loved your comments about the soil, the chemical names too, like hammer. My favorite is Roundup, which you use on plants that can't move. So it's going to be 100% effective, isn't it? It's like, or 100% ineffective, I suppose, if they can't move. The role of the soil crust is an interesting one. So it's not quite bare ground in that it's open and so on, but it does have a rich sort of lichens and cryptograms and so on across it that seems to have a lot of influence on the soil biology, letting water in and out, providing micro sites for seed germination and that sort of thing. I was wondering how you think that sort of fits into the world.
I got to kind of visit some rangelands a couple of years ago, and I haven't done a lot of work in rangelands, but I learned a lot about those soil cross and their huge ecological niche they fill in those environments. So you're right, and that is, different context with different rainfall patterns and different, it's just so different to where I am. Those species are part of that ecosystem, and they're playing a huge role, aren't they? So. But it is also successionally, that's where it's at. And it will probably, it's not going to get the rainfall maybe to sustain other things as quickly. But yeah, I've got a lot to learn on that one, but I found a huge appreciation for them. Yeah. In the ecosystem as well. But yeah, and yeah, the use of fertilizers can actually create weeds. You're right, Jerry. They're definitely part of that system. Once we start interrupting these systems, I think that our management sends the signals for those weeds that germinate, and they're telling us a story, and different fertilizer regimes can actually encourage different plants for sure. Just keep reading.
So they sort of, it sounds, the argument sounds like weeds sort of do themselves out of a job, don't they? They come in, they create this situation for something else to happen, but that doesn't sound very evolutionarily smart to like that.
And they produce all these seeds, don't they, that then sit in a seed bank for such a long time until they're needed again. Like we noticed after the fire here, we had the fleabane in the paddocks, but we also had a lot of nightshade weeds, which are nitrogen accumulators. And we don't generally have them in that granite soil. It's not a really fertile system. And so after 15 years to have never seen this plant suddenly have it growing everywhere. And we realized that as the soil biology, the fire, that disturbance had set that the whole successional process back, but it also had impacted the biological health of the soil. And we had no protozoa and no other higher order organisms in the soil food web to cycle the nitrogen that bacteria hold in their bodies. So those weeds came to soak it up. And we're like, oh, wow, protozoa deficiency in the soil. And if you got nitrate weeds, often it's that nitrogen cycle that's an issue. You can make a protozoa tea out of soaking lucerne in water for a few days, and that will inoculate protozoa. And you can water that back on. It's hard to do on big scale, but on smaller scales, you can try it and see. Really interesting.
You mentioned a lab here that in Melbourne that was good at
Yes.
So is it an easy test to do to determine the relative proportions of fungi to bacteria to protozoa or whatever in your soil?
It's an expensive test to do, but it's really interesting. So it's about $280, $300 per sample when they'll use a microscope to give you a full soil food web analysis. So what bacteria there, fungi, mycorrhizal fungi, protozoa, different types of protozoa and nematodes. To give you that picture, it can be really interesting to learn about. There are some sort of cheaper kits that are kicking around in the regenerative ag space where they'll do a micro bacteria fungi ratio with a kit in the paddock. I don't use them because I can see a soil is telling me what's going on by the weeds that are growing, by the soil structure. A bacterial soil is powdery and lacking in structure. Visually, the indicators tell me a lot. So I only do the biological tests when a client really wants to baseline it, really wants to go deep or monitor that really closely, because it is $300 a sample. But for some big scale farmers, that's nothing because their system, that's going to guide them and help them save money. But if you're just curious, sometimes that can be a stretch. So you can start to look more at the type of soil you have, and the weeds that are growing are telling you that. More woody weeds could be indicating slightly different things in a system. Technically, they say they feel that niche that's a bit more fungal, but I'm not sure that's exactly right with my observation. I think they're a whole different ball game, and it's often lack of impact, or the soil's just really low in biological activity. But yeah, it's in that niche and in that succession, they do have that role, don't they, of coming in on the way to that forested ecosystem. But yeah, I'll put the lab in the chat as well. Dr. Mary Cole is amazing wealth of information on soil biology. I love the tests that lab does, and she does a lot of teaching on this in depth. So if you were looking for someone on soil biology, I could highly recommend her.
Okay.
Yeah.
We've got one more question. We might have to make this the last, but getting up to
Yeah.
close to 7:45. If one has compacted soils like capeweed, what can be done to improve soil health in a revegetation, rather than grazing?
Yeah. That's a tricky one, capeweed, isn't it? And I think it's filling a niche around mineral cycling. So you could also try, I was talking on the weeds webinar the other day, we were looking at the daisies and how they link with potassium, but also capeweed's a nitrate accumulator. You could think about using some fertilizers to see if that will shift it along. So a lot of weeds calcium's a huge link with a lot of weeds. A lot of people use calcium in a system. And one farmer I was talking to, he was an organic cropper the other day, who uses calcium and gypsum in a system to help reduce the impact of weeds in his crops. They don't kill them, but it makes the conditions less suitable to the weeds, because calcium processes are more functional in the soil when there's fungi. So we're starting off, calcium's often there, but not functional. So calcium's a big one, but also thinking about the fertility and with capeweed, whether you could think about fertility, calcium. It's hard for me to give you an exact element because I don't know your context, but sometimes looking at that soil fertility angle can help shift a plant on a little bit quicker. Yeah. Again, look at your soil, your context. What's this weed telling me right here? Maybe take a soil test and understand what might be a bit out of whack, but also look at that plant. Yeah, and then the brassica after the fire. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And then you saw those weeds moving through. And I think in grasslands, I'll be honest, grasslands are much more simple to observe succession in than a cropping system, for example. But it takes a long time on nature's time frame, doesn't it? And that's the patience bit. Yeah. But I hope I'm no doubt I've given you more questions, but I hope that keeps you curious and gives you some food for thought anyway.
Yes, indeed. And you've given us Norma Bateson and some other.
Right.
You've had a lot of names come up, so that's great.
I will send you some links, Adrian, and in the morning, and you can find them out. Yeah.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. It's been a real eye opener, and it's good to take this leap into the complexity of soil. So thank you. And we will we'll just take a 10-minute break to have our dinner or toilet break or whatever. So it's 7:46 now. So let's come back at 5 to 8 and we will continue with our Grassy Plains Network meeting then. All right.
Thank you for having
everybody.
me.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'll head off now.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.